Super. Well, thanks. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Chuck Sox. I'm the Associate Dean for Impact and Partnerships here in the Lindner College of Business. And I'm joined by Michael Jones and Stephen Jones, who are both faculty members in the college. And we're going to talk to you tonight about leveraging data for learning and agility. So I've introduced myself. Let me give Michael and Stephen a chance to introduce themselves a bit. So let me hand it over to Michael. Michael, you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Chuck. My name is Michael Jones, and I've been in the economics department now for about 8 years. And in addition to my teaching roles, I'm also the executive director for the Altubel Economics Institute, which does a lot of research with undergraduate students, as well as being the academic director for an applied economics program.
Okay, Stephen?
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Jones. I am an adjunct professor in the operations management. I teach operations management, quality, project management, and we'll be teaching Lean Kaizen this upcoming year. Externally, I'm also currently the head of training and quality with a Green Dot Bank and a proud 1991 graduate of the University of Cincinnati.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. Thank you for joining me tonight on this presentation. So let me jump in. We'll be sort of passing the mic a bit between the three of us, and then we'll have some questions at the end, as Matt's indicated, and you can submit those through the Q&A box there on the control panel, and we'll be happy to answer those. So we're going to kind of walk through these topics real briefly. Talk about data in general. What is data? Why is it important? Agility, what's the role of agility in organizations? How does that relate to data? Learning, how do we learn? What does that look like in the context of data? And then data literacy, which is a growing need that we're seeing in business and society. And then, as I said, we'll wrap up at the end with some Q&A. So data, what's the value of data? We talked about the value of data in this data information age, and the value of data is really in improving decisions. So I can give you all sorts of data. You can go out and Google anything, right? We have a sort of a common idiom. What's that have to do with the price of tea in China? And you might wonder where did that phrase come from? We often use that phrase to talk about something, information that's relevant or irrelevant. In the 1800s in Britain, in the House of Commons, when they were debating issues and topics, the tea from China was very important to the British economy. They liked their tea, they enjoyed it. So the price of tea in China was very important to the British economy. And so anytime someone was talking about something that was really kind of off topic or not relevant to the subject at hand, that would be the quip that they'd ask him. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? So that may not be relevant to you, but if you're in the 1800s in Britain, that was an important piece of information to have. So a lot of data that's out there that's available, and we talk about the value of data being, to what degree does it help us improve decision making. There's a lot of data collection out there. The technology age that we live in provides lots of sources of data. The point of sale scanners where you check out in the grocery store or the department store. The loyalty card that you scan for the Kroger checkout to get your gas points. Kroger is actually collecting information about what you're buying as you do that. Our cell phones that we carry on with us are continuously gathering data that's been used by various organizations to market things to us or to understand what our behaviors are. Those little cookie notices that you get in your web browser, those cookies are used to track what websites you're going to, what you're looking at. And so this explosion of technology has also created an explosion in data. And companies and other organizations are harvesting that data, using that data to understand our purchasing patterns and our behavior. And we'll talk about some specific examples of those. Another important aspect of data and data analytics is cleaning data. So even though we have all this technology and data collections is highly automated, data errors are still very, very common. And a function of how databases are constructed, how the data is collected. Sometimes there's some still some manual processes involved in handling data. So it's always important to examine data, understand what the potential sources of error, make sure you correct for those. So not all data is equally valuable. It's important to account for that. Agility. So think about agility, think about athletes being agile. What does agility mean in the context of information and data analysis? So agility is the ability to quickly use new information to make decisions and to take actions based on that new information. So just because a company has access to real-time information doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to act on it very quickly. And I'll talk about that in the context of an example here in just a minute. That relates also to uncertainty. So information is very important in terms of how it helps us deal with uncertainty. Uncertainty creates operational costs and opportunity costs. So think of some examples. So barbecue ribs is one of my favorite dishes, and one of the things that always frustrates me is I go to a barbecue restaurant, and if I go a little bit later in the evening, they will have run out. Well, they only cook so many ribs per particular day because they're much better when they're fresh. They don't like to keep them overnight. So part of the challenge is deciding, well, how many do we make? And you think about it, these restaurants tend to have more customers on the weekend or certain nights, right? So they'll cook more on certain days than other days. But they're guessing at how many customers are going to come in and order ribs. So if they don't cook enough, then they miss out on some lost sales, right? They could have made selling ribs. If they make too many, then they carry over. They're not fresh. They may have to dispose of them at a reduced cost or something. So there's an operational cost associated with that. There are many examples like that. So think of a florist buying flowers, wanting to have fresh cut flowers. Christmas trees, having fresh Christmas trees in stock. Again, those are all subject to uncertainty around how much demand there's going to be. So how do organizations, how do companies deal with that uncertainty? Well, there are kind of two strategies. There's hedging and then responding or being agile. So hedging is, all right, so I'm going to carry some extra inventory just in case, or I'm going to have some extra production capacity just in case the demand is higher than I expect, so that I've got some buffer there. A better approach would be getting more information and reacting to that information. So perhaps I could allow customers to place advance orders or reservations and offer a discount for doing that. That allows me to gather more information, better information about what the demand is going to be, and then I can react or respond to that information. So that's the notion of agility, is using information to reactively respond to that information, to take decisions and take actions on a short time frame. I'll talk about a specific example in our recent experiences related to supply chains and COVID-19 and freight transportation. So when the quarantine restrictions were implemented here in the U.S., schools shut down, factories shut down, businesses shut down, and this led to just radical changes in demand for freight transportation. Freight shipments were canceled. Factories that were closing down would call the carrier, call the vendor, and cancel the shipment. And in other cases, companies like Kroger, grocery stores, were running out of products. So then they were calling their shippers, calling their carriers, and asking them to expedite the freight, get it here even more quickly. Or they were trying to run around trying to call other carriers to help pick up additional loads that they needed. So we've got tons of examples of products where we ran out. Food products, toilet paper is one of the most commonly talked about products that we ran out of. Cleaning supplies, and all this is a result of these places closing. Of people, instead of being in school or at work during the day, now we're all at home, right? So we've got to go to our local grocery store to buy those paper products, cleaning products, food products that we would normally purchase in restaurants or in the cafeteria at work or at school. And so supply chains had to adjust. So the distribution centers, the shipments, the packaging of the products that go to institutional services like restaurants and cafeterias and schools. They are completely different supply chains from the supply chains used to resupply grocery stores and their distribution centers. So companies, carriers, trucking companies that had access to real-time freight information and pricing data were able to respond to that sudden shift in demand much better than companies that didn't have access to that data. Now you might think, oh, well, of course they had access to that data. Well, no, not actually. The trucking information, the trucking industry, the freight transportation industry traditionally has been a bit behind on the curve of taking advantage of data analytics. But certain companies have really gained competitive advantage by gathering that information, sharing that with carriers and with shippers, allowing them to respond in real time very quickly to shifts in freight requirements and prices even. So that allowed some companies to gain competitive advantage. We're still seeing some challenges in our food and grocery supply chains, but companies are slowly able to adjust to that. Here's some data that I was able to get access to through one of our local industry partners in the freight transportation industry. This graph shows freight shipment cancellations from January through early April, and you'll see around mid-March, as the quarantine restrictions were put in place, we see a big huge spike in surge in cancellations of freight shipments. So that created all sorts of problems in the freight transportation industry. Here's another graph. This shows outbound shipment volume. You'd be wondering what a reefer is. A reefer is a refrigerated truck. So these tend to be food products are the most common type of freight shipped in refrigerated trucks. You can see some fluctuations in shipments around holidays. So we have 4th of July here, and then Labor Day, and then Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. So you see some drops in shipments. But then as we approach mid-March and into April, again, a huge surge in refrigerated shipments due primarily to food products, the spike in demand in grocery stores for those food products. So this is data that is collected by a certain firm. It's made available to shippers who understand how to use this kind of information. This is aggregate information, and so it's interesting for us to look at that. But what carriers need to know is exactly where are those loads, which cities, which shippers, which manufacturers, producers, distributors actually have shipments that need to be transported, and where do those need to go. So this data is very aggregated, but behind it is the very detailed data that trucking companies, freight carriers need to know in order to make sure they have their equipment in locations where they can pick up shipments that need to be moved from that location. So we talked about data in general, agility, and now we'll talk about learning. So we want to learn and gather information from this data. There's what I think of as sort of static data analysis, which is statistical analysis of historical data. So we're looking at patterns, trying to discover patterns and relationships from data that we've collected from past history. So that's a very common form of learning from data. Another form of learning is what I would describe as active learning, where we're intentionally experimenting, trying different approaches. Think of exploring versus exploiting. So if I'm trying to make a decision about where I want to eat tonight, if I'm able to go out to eat again, I might have a decision to make. Do I want to go to a new restaurant, try something new, gather some new information about a restaurant, or do I want to just go to one of my favorite restaurants that I already have the information about? I know I like it. I've got my favorite dishes there. So that's part of the challenge that we have to think about when it comes to active learning is when do we take risks to gather new information versus when do we take advantage of the information we already have, right, to exploit that. Related to that is this notion of experimentation, right? Conducting experiments, gathering information by trying different alternatives. And part of that experimentation process is a classical technique called DMAC. And I'm gonna pass the mic over to Stephen, and he's going to talk a little bit about the DMAC process and what that means related to learning from data.
All right, thanks, Chuck. Yeah, and that's a great introduction. So when we talk about what DMAC is, and I'll walk you through. Fundamentally, what DMAC is, it's a framework for problem solving. Whether any type of problem you're dealing with, and in business, especially if we're dealing with project management, it also serves as a project framework for solving a problem where you don't know what the solution is, right? And so I find that this is, my experience, this is an incredibly necessary skill for any type of manager, whether you're in operations or any part of business, because I've got a saying in my field that, you know, an operations manager who can't solve problems is a problem that another operation manager has to solve. And so having problem solving skills and having a structured framework for being able to effectively assess a problem and solve it is just critical for anything you do. And another benefit of DMAC, what it does is it essentially helps you make a complicated problem or a complicated situation a little simpler to understand and communicate. And so as we go through, we'll talk about what DMAC is. And DMAC is based upon an acronym, DMAIC, which comes from define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. In that first line of define, you approach a problem, you approach a situation, you begin asking, you know, who is suffering from the problem? You know, who is experiencing the problem? And what is the problem specifically? How long has the problem existed? Where does the problem exist? How big is the problem? And ultimately, what is the goal? Where do we want to get to? What is our definition of a solution, right, for the problem? The next thing we want to do is we want to measure this problem, right? We want to understand how long has it gone on, how many times has it occurred, how much, how great. And we also want to be able to segment, you know, and look at the different aspects of the problem that we've defined according to those measures. Once we've done that, then we want to analyze those big elements, so where we're seeing the majority of the problem occur. And then we want to start understanding, you know, what is happening? Why is this happening? And then ultimately, we want to get to the root causes that are driving this problem from occurring. Once we've effectively identified what those root causes are, then we move on to the improve phase, where we begin to understand, okay, what do we need to do to improve the process or prevent this problem from occurring ever again? Then we pilot solutions to test our hypothesis, to prove what our improved process is, or our change is, our mitigation. And from there, we develop what's the control section, or the control plan. And in the control phase, this really breaks down how we're going to maintain the improvement and ensure that the problem does not resurface. Because one of the big problems that I've seen in business for many years is people will produce solutions to a problem that either create failure points somewhere else, or the problem simply resurfaces a little further on down the road. So our objective is, how are we going to solve the problem permanently? And so wanted to share just how this applies. And, you know, COVID is a big thing that we're all dealing with. That's why we're not in person right now. You know, we're virtual. But just a real simple application of DMAC against looking at COVID and trying to deal with the death rates. So if we move to the next slide, and I pulled this data, excuse me, from a London publication, the Financial Times, and it really gets into this graphical representation. So early on, when the coronavirus deaths really started kicking off, they were really strong and high in Italy, Spain, and the UK, and then we started to see it coming along in the US a little bit more rapidly than it actually began in China. And so we were first, you would go in and you define what is the problem, and this is actually the definition, looking at the death rates across these regions. And then we began to measure, or counting the volume of those death rates. And then using a graphical representation, which we've used in that measure phase, we begin to chart and look at the comparative death rates in each country and begin to compare. So again, DMAC helps you take the complicated and view it in a way where it becomes a little bit more simpler or easier to understand. Through this graphical representation, we wanted to analyze and say, okay, well, we're measuring the differences. And one of the visible immediate differences was the slope of the death rate in different countries. And so we see that it really fell into two core areas. There's the area at the top where you've got the Spain and Italy and UK, France, US, and China to a certain piece. But then also there's another piece that broke off that we saw in Japan and Korea. And so, Chuck, if you could just advance the animation, it allows us to see that we actually had two different behaviors in this death rate based upon these countries. So in the measuring, we're able to see that there's differences in how my data is showing me differences in how this problem is manifesting. And then in the analyze, we begin asking the question, why? Why is it that Japan and Korea had a lower slope to their death rate than these other countries? And in digging to the why, one of the things that comes out is that in Japan and South Korea, it's been part of their society that they've worn masks for years. Part of my graduate studies I did in Japan, and I've been to South Korea a number of times over the last 15 years. And it's always been very common to see people wearing masks. And as part of the test or pilot, that was something that would be used in the improve phase to say, hey, look, let's look at the impact of wearing masks. And what does that actually do to the death rate? And what we've seen, since various regions, parts of the country where masks were employed and they were used at a high level, we began to see this what's called flattening of the curve, right? And so this was just a real simple way that DMAC could be used and applied to help identify how we can potentially improve a process, reduce defects or failures in a process to drive improvement. And then the last piece, which we really don't get into, is the control piece. Because in order to maintain this, you've got to have a control to the behaviors and to the performance to ensure that this problem does not reoccur. I'm not going to get too far off into it, but you can see where in areas in our country where maybe the control was not sustained long enough, we began to see a reemergence in the curve, right? But at a real fundamental basic way, this is how we could use DMAC to help identify improvements, or at least identify areas for experimentation in very complex situations, but fundamentally make sure that we apply a structure and a rigor to the process to ensure that we don't overlook any common problems, or overlook any hidden problems, I should say, to ensure that we come up with the best solution based upon fact as possible. So I won't belabor that point anymore. I'll turn it over to Mr. Michael Jones. No relation there, although we have a great resemblance.
Thanks, David. I really appreciate that. And beginning of this presentation, we heard how Chuck opened this by saying that we really want to rely on data to help us improve our ability to make better decisions. And IBM at one point had estimated that just in the last decade, we've had more data created than the entire history of the world up until this point. And so we are drowning in a sea of data. In fact, it's one of the characteristics that we'll talk a bit maybe at the end about this fourth industrial revolution that we're in, is we have so much data. And I would ask the question, are we really making better decisions as a result? And so if we have all this data, I think we intuitively recognize there must be something else. There must be something more that we need when we analyze this data. And in fact, it's sometimes the case that more data isn't always better. It doesn't actually always lead to better decisions. And I'll go into an example here in a second. And I want us to think more about what is that environment and the incentives that produce that data. There is a data generating process. And Stephen was just talking about, how do we get the death rates, right? How is that data being generated? What's the environment? What are the incentives? And what I would argue, and one of the things that you'll learn as you go through your course of study at Lindner is you're going to learn the analytical techniques. You'll learn the statistics. You'll learn those very important methodologies. but you're also going to learn how to extract meaning from data. You need to be able to translate that data and into information in order to make those important decisions. And so on the next slide, I'm actually going to walk through an example of what I mean by this, where more data doesn't actually always lead to a better decision. In fact, it might even give you a sense of false confidence. So earlier this year, really a historic event occurred. It's what we sometimes call a black swan event. And in the early part of this year, the price of oil, a barrel of oil, actually fell to be negative. At one point, you can see there on the graph where that sharp spike goes down, it was negative $37 for a barrel of oil. And yes, that means that the seller is actually paying the buyer $37 to take that oil off of their hands. And you might be thinking, well, what's going on there? How can we possibly explain an event in which you have negative prices? Aren't prices always supposed to be positive? And I'm only showing you a snapshot here. You can look at this data. It begins in 2019, but if I gave you more data, we could go back decades. We can go back to the 50s, and you're actually never going to see a negative price. Now, you're always going to see these positive price points. And so how can you actually prepare for these black swan events, right? The COVID-19, these events that you can't necessarily see by having more data. And what I would encourage you to think more about is you have to understand the environment and the incentives behind this data. So what happened here? Well, when you think about buying oil, this is not the oil that you just buy at the pump, right? So these prices are contracts. They're contracts that traders will buy, that they'll actually take delivery of that oil in the future. Right? So these are what we call futures contracts. And so what that means is in the month of April, when you pay $13 or $20 for a barrel of oil, it means the following month, you literally have to go to a physical location. In this case, you're going to have to go to a pipeline in Oklahoma, and you're going to have to take delivery of that oil. Right? And so that's what you're agreeing to, and you pay for the price of oil. So notice what happens here right around March. Right? We talked about COVID-19. So you promised that you're going to take delivery of this oil in April, but now all of a sudden COVID happens and demand for oil just drops completely through the floor. Right? Airlines aren't flying. Consumers aren't getting in their car. But you still got a contract that says you're going to take oil off of this pipeline in April. So now you got a problem that nobody wants this oil. You've got to take it. And so what happens is you go to this pipeline. Well, everybody else is in the same problem, and so they bought all the storage around that pipeline, because you might say, well, let me just take the oil and store it somewhere. So now you find yourself in a situation where I can't find anybody to take the oil. I can't store it, so I'm going to have to pay somebody to take this oil far, far away and store it somewhere else. And in fact, that's what happened, right? You understand that in this environment, you have to go to a pipeline. You take delivery of this in the future. And if the environment's there where you can't store it, you might be stuck with oil on your hands and have to actually pay somebody to take it off your hands. Now you'll see, real quickly, you'll actually see two different lines there. You're going to see Brent and you're going to see WTI. And so WTI is the type of oil I've talked about in this example, which is called West Texas Intermediate. And so remember, this is specific oil that you have to take from a pipeline. In contrast, Brent oil it's delivered in the North Sea, so it doesn't have the same landlocked storage problem. You can get these big oil tankers that can go up, they take the delivery, they can store it elsewhere. And so if you understand that environment, you understand how this data is being generated, a lot of traders got caught in a world of hurt because they were buying and selling these contracts, not really understanding the market, not understanding what was going on. They wanted to just get in, buy the contract, and sell it to somebody else before they actually had to take delivery, right? And they didn't really pay attention to the details. And so that's one example of where, having more data, getting more prices, or building more sophisticated forecasting models isn't actually going to help you. And in fact, it might even give you a false confidence that you know what's going to happen, when really you need to spend more time understanding the data generating process. So on the next slide, I don't want to be all negative. Economists are kind of this, we get this reputation for being the dismal science. So let me just give you kind of some more upbeat, powerful cases for data. And in fact, today, just a few hours ago, you had all of the big tech CEOs talking about how they're using data. And we heard from Amazon, we heard from Facebook. And I want to show you just a quick example here. This is looking at Uber and their data. I mentioned we've had this explosion of data. There are things that we can do now that we could not do 12, 15 years ago. Right now, Uber has millions and hundreds of millions of data points that they know exactly how much someone is willing to pay. They know exactly where they're willing to go, at what time of day. And so they could build these really sophisticated, fancy models. Now, with that power comes a lot of responsibility. And in fact, that meeting today with the big tech CEOs, they were asked a lot of questions about what are they going to do with this data, right? Do they have a social responsibility to use this data properly? And so here's an example. They were looking at tips. And so you're looking at over time, Uber can track the amount of tips that a person receives based on different demographic characteristics, based on someone's age, based on someone's gender. What's really interesting here is that once you control or you take into account all of the characteristics of the drivers, the time of day, the rating, there's still a slight difference in the tips that a person earns based on their age, based on their gender. And the question starts to become, well, what should businesses do with this data? And so maybe we'll get a chance to explore this towards the end of this panel, is that with this data comes a lot of responsibility. I think we're wrestling with that right now as a society is, do these businesses have the responsibility when they identify disparities in the data? There's differences in ages, differences in genders. There was a great example last year where Airbnb, they looked at their data and they found that people who wanted to rent with an African-American sounding name, their requested reservations were denied much greater than someone with a white name. So what does Airbnb do with this data? Right, they've got access to all this information, stuff that we couldn't really do 10, 15 years ago. How do businesses act responsibly, and what does society require of these businesses? So we're in a new world. Let me just close with a couple more examples. I want to piggyback here off of Stephen and talk about COVID-19, because it's changed even our economics profession. So, Chuck and Stephen are both more analytical oriented. And in economics, we rely on data to make decisions as well. But we typically think about these what we call low frequency data points. So we don't get as much information about the economy as we might like. In fact, we're going to hear very shortly what the economy's or what the GDP was, which is our gross domestic product for the second quarter, right? So economists were really waiting to see what happened to the economy in the last 3 months, right? This is going to be a huge number. The Federal Reserve is paying attention to it. Businesses are paying attention to it. But notice that we still don't know that answer. We're waiting 3 months into the second quarter to know how the economy is doing. So what's happening now in this explosion of data, this is fourth industrial revolution, is that economists and businesses and politicians, we need to rely on much different types of data. Chuck was mentioning all these different data sources so that we can make more informed decisions. So here's a couple examples that in COVID-19 that we really relied on this, what we call high frequency data which is released weekly, daily, or even on an hourly basis. So what you're looking at here is when the stay-at-home orders went into effect. So in March, a lot of the countries across the world implemented stay-at-home orders. Can't go to a restaurant, they're shut down. Now, what you see here in this chart is that, of course, by March 21st, restaurants were shut down. And you're looking at data from OpenTable, right? OpenTable, it's an app where you can go in and request a reservation for a specific time so that you can make sure you have a seat there. So what was happening was that consumers were anticipating that, I don't want to go out to a restaurant now. I know that the situation is bad. I'm not going to wait for the lockdown order or the shutdown order to go into effect. I'm going to start canceling my reservation now. And so that's the chart you start to see. If you look between March 9th and March 13th, right, you see this 20% drop where consumers are starting to cancel in anticipation of what's going to happen. And so now if you're thinking, well, how do we make decisions knowing that consumers are going to anticipate what we do, it changes the way you have to make those decisions. And I'll close with one more example here, Chuck, on this last slide. So economists, instead of relying on these more slower moving types of data, which are GDP, unemployment rate, some economists have actually started to partner with credit card companies, with retail stores, to get, again, daily estimates of consumer spending by different geographies. So now we're not just talking about the United States, what's happened to the United States economy. We can go through and look by specific region. We can go into Ohio. We can look at on a daily basis, where's the drop in consumer spending coming from. And so what this chart shows is that they're looking at low income spending versus high income spending. So individuals that are low income, individuals that are high income. And what they found is they plot this on a daily basis, they start to see how has the COVID-19 crisis affected spending. Well, once the stimulus payments started, and this again is a very relevant policy decision we're having today with the, do we extend the unemployment insurance? Do we extend the stimulus payments? So we need kind of data, really good data on what has been the effect in the past. And so by partnering with companies, governments can start to see, okay, when we've introduced the stimulus, it did allow for those with individuals with lower incomes to rebound, right? They're able to use this money to spend, but it really hasn't offset a lot of that spending from the high income individuals. And so part of this discussion becomes, what do we do moving forward, right? We have these different approaches to how individuals are responding to data, so we need to think harder about what that approach might look like. So I know we wanted to leave, somewhere around 15 minutes. I personally like to leave even more time because I'd like this to be more interactive in a discussion. But I just close by encouraging you to continue to use the DMAC process. It's a wonderful tool, but also at the same time, keep thinking about how that data was generated, what's the environment, and what are those incentives.
Okay. Matt, do we have any questions at this point?
Nothing so far, but this is a great time. If you have not asked questions or if you have some burning stuff, obviously that's the section of the segment that we're at now. So feel free to type those questions in, and we'll get those taken care of.
Okay. I'll throw out. I've got a couple questions I've put together, and maybe we'll start with maybe Stephen. Stephen, what are some job opportunities if a student's interested in what they've seen here in this data analytics? Where could they look for potential career paths or job opportunities? What might they end up doing for a career?
It works better when I answer off of mute. But great question. Understanding data and data analytics is really valuable in any course, any career that you could imagine, because as we kind of highlighted here, data is permeating every business. I don't think most people think about the amount of data collection that goes on in your Uber transaction, right? And how much demographic information is captured to assess purchasing patterns. And so when you think about how that compares, it can flow into any aspect, in any industry, but some specific careers, obviously in operations management, data is critically essential because you need data in order to be able to effectively manage the business that you're responsible for. But it also gets into, certainly in any part of business, I think there's common misconceptions like in the practice of marketing. People think of marketing as advertising, when in fact marketing is really the process of crunching the data, the consumer data that's essential to understand customer buying patterns. Even when you get into sales, I have a good friend of mine who is a sales manager at Best Buy, and the way they deliver and they sell products there is really incredibly advanced. Even if you think about if you have a smart television, the smart televisions today have become incredibly inexpensive. Not just because of the improvement in the manufacturing, the lowering the cost of manufacturing, but because the cost of the device is subsidized by all of those wonderful little streaming services that come preloaded on your television. They come preloaded because they want you to use them, because they want to be able to understand your viewing habits, your behaviors in the home, and all of that data is captured. So pretty much any aspect, having an element of the understanding of data analytics is only going to help you improve in whatever career field you choose to go into.
Okay. Michael, anything you want to add there?
No, I don't have much to add. I would just encourage you to think about, you think about the tech companies and manufacturing, those are common, but maybe explore the small or the family businesses. There might be an opportunity there to really make an impact. You're going to have a lot of skills once you graduate, and think about maybe those smaller markets where you can apply.
Okay. I think you may have mentioned this, Michael, but what are some relevant courses or majors that you can think of that students should consider pursuing if they're interested in this area?
Right, that's a great question. I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. Thanks, guys. You can't really understand data and analysis and using these data to do forecasting models unless you understand math. As much as we want to say, there's opportunities for everyone, you do need to have a pretty solid understanding of math, statistics, and even logic, right? So understanding how the data is created, understanding the types of questions that you can ask. I mean, the process that Stephen described was very logical, right? There's a very consistent framework that he used to solve the problem. The other point I would say, though, is there's a lot of discussion right now, but you just don't want one side of the brain. To be able to use data appropriately, you need the right brain, the left brain. You need them both. And so I was at a conference in the fall talking with a head of an analytics department. He said the last 3 hires in an analytics role were music majors. All right, and so they had the stats, right? So it wasn't that they didn't take stats; they knew some basic programming, but they really, were able to utilize the creative portion of their brain. And so, as you think about your career in Lindner, whether it's finance you major in, or analytics, or whatever it is, I would encourage you to continue to explore that creative part. Take a music class, take a philosophy class. In fact, I was a classics major and a computer science major. And I think that's really helped me because classics is the study of human behavior. What does it mean to be a human being? And so I think that framework has really helped me think about approaches to data. And so I'd encourage you to do both your right and your left brain.
Hey, Chuck, if I could respond to that as well, I absolutely echo that point. It's one thing to have the analytical piece to be able to comprehend the data and be able to perform the statistical analysis. But one of the critical elements of success is how well you can see what's not immediately there. And I think that's when Mike talked about the musical aspect. One of my hobbies is photography, because in photography you have to be able to capture what may not actually be there, if that makes sense. And so you have to see something in your mind's eye and then be able to program the camera to be able to capture what's in your mind's eye and not what's necessarily right there. And so having the balance between the left and the right brain is really essential to be able to make that translation happen, and especially be able to communicate what the findings are to the broader population.
Well, one thing I would add to that myself too is that maybe it's a bit obvious, but computers, being comfortable working with computers, working with computer applications. I'm probably going to reveal my age, but when I went through school, we still did math by hand and on calculators, and didn't have computers. So that really has revolutionized data analytics is the ability to process large amounts of data, so I'd encourage you to pick up some computer skills and understand how to use applications that manipulate data. So spreadsheets like Excel, even maybe taking some coding, some programming classes. A lot of high schools now offer programming courses, so if you have an opportunity to pursue that. And then even in college, UC offers a number of different programming languages that you can take, and we're seeing more and more companies in the business community looking for even business students with some coding skills, some programming skills. So, good. Matt, any questions coming in from the audience yet?
Not so far, but I think this is a great discussion. Keep it going.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm starting to run out of questions, but I'll throw. I think we've kind of already addressed this one. How is data analytics affecting the future of work for everyone? So, we typically historically thought of data analysts as being people that, single individuals working by themselves or in small teams, right? And they're sort of the guru that everybody else comes to analyze and interpret their data. So how is this data analytics explosion kind of affecting not just those individuals, but everyone in the workplace? Stephen, you wanna respond to that?
Sure. It's really affecting everyone because it's forcing people who maybe historically didn't have that element, that study, those skills, to really have to reassess their skills and go out and find a means to build those skills if they want to continue to compete and be and advance, quite frankly. In many organizations today, having those skills has a real direct correlation in your opportunity for advancement, right? That's one of the things I deal with historically in my prior company I worked for, actually for the last couple of companies. The biggest chunk of what I did was I taught DMAC fundamentals. I taught basic statistics. I taught basic data analytics to managers who historically had shied away from that thing. And as soon as I came in talking about statistics, it was like, oh, I avoided that in school. I don't want to deal with that. But the reality of it was they can't avoid it. And if they they really had the need to be able to not only perform basic fundamental analytical analysis, but really to be able to interpret and comprehend them, and then be able to explain them. You probably heard, it's really, people say when you talk about statistics, there's this adage that, oh, you can make statistics say anything. And what I always tell people is, you can try to do that, but if you understand the language of statistics, then you won't be misdirected, right? And no one can give you information or misrepresent something to you. So it's really more in your best interest that you learn how to interpret it, so that way you can properly interpret it for yourself and come to your own best conclusion. So that's where I really see a big drive and push.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. I like to describe that as being a well-educated consumer of data, even if you're not the analyst creating, running the models, creating the reports, pulling the data. If you're relying on that kind of analysis to make decisions, then, like you said, you want to be able to understand what's being communicated to you, certainly recognize when information perhaps is being misinterpreted or misrepresented. So it's really being a well-informed consumer of data analytics. Yeah, good. Michael, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think I looked at this question slightly differently, and I hate to become the dismal scientist again, but sometimes when you look at all this data, you see it replacing jobs, right? You see it, if you're thinking about majoring in finance and you wonder, well, I've got all this data coming in, and I've got these tools that will automate the market transactions, where's my role going to fit in here? And so I would encourage you to think about those types of jobs that are going to be really in demand in the future, requiring data analysis, because even those programs can start programming themselves, right? There are tools that our students sometimes find themselves using where the program will pick which model based on some certain characteristics. So what I would encourage you to do is you think about what is that future of work. Stephen talked about the importance of communication and recognizing when someone's telling you, basically gaslighting you, right? So someone's trying to tell you something that's not true with the data. So what I would encourage you, the future of this is you know what questions to ask, right? So when someone presents this chart and someone says, hey, this is what the solution is, you know the data and you can push back, and you have that critical thinking that knows the question to ask and knows what the point of that data was collected for. So, kind of the future is those jobs which have that interpersonal skills, which yes, know the statistics, yes, know the analysis, but can communicate that to someone else in the workforce.
Yeah, that was going to be my last question. What are some of the important skills that are needed in this field? And I think we've touched on it a little bit already. That the math skills, quant skills, computer skills, but communication skills are extremely important in data analytics. You can be someone very, very good at pulling data, writing programs, creating charts, running models. But at the end of the day, you've got to effectively communicate the implications of your analysis to the decision makers in your organization. And if you can't do that in a way, clearly and in a way that convinces them of the validity and the potential impact of your recommendations, then things aren't going to change, right? It's going to be ignored. So communication skills are very, very important. And I see from my own students and the opportunities that they encounter that really is a differentiator, that they may be really good technically, but what differentiates students that have lots of job offers or get better job offers is that they're able to communicate their analytics very, very effectively.
Hey Chuck, if I could tag in on that, not only from what I've heard from some of my students, but also in the companies I work at, this is part of the interview process. In many cases, we use case studies for candidates in the interview, and we give them the case study and we ask them, how would you approach this problem? How would you explain it? How would you break it down? How would you determine a course of action? And we're not just really evaluating their response based on the accuracy or the correctness of it, because in most cases it's what's the least wrong answer or what's the most right answer. But we also really want to hear how well and how persuasive they are in their communication. And I think this also, also needs to be said that we talk about skills that are really going to be essential in that communication. It's also language skills. Because, all the more we work in more and more global organizations. And there have been many times in my career, I've been in a room and I was the only person who spoke English as a first language. And my dialect of English, being from Midwestern United States, is different than someone coming from the UK or Australia. And so even having, wherever, one of the things I love what you see in our co-op experiences, and we have international learning experiences, get those. Because you're, in the course of time, definitely going to be working with people who don't necessarily speak our English as a first language. And we have to be able to account for that in our communication as well. So yeah, being able to have that is critical. And then also understanding the nuances that everybody doesn't speak the same dialect of English as we do is critically important.
Uh-huh. Good. I see we're coming up on the top of the hour, man. One last thing I would add is the importance of continual learning, lifelong learning, in this area of data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these technologies. They're continually evolving, and so it's important that students, while they're at UC, learn how to learn, because particularly if you're in a field like this that's so dynamic and evolving, the technologies that you're using, in school when you graduate are going to be different from the technologies you're using 5, 10 years down the road. So you've got to continually be kind of investing in yourself, investing in your learning, making sure you're staying abreast with those new developing technologies that come out in this field in particular. I think that's true of a lot of fields, but I think of this field in particular.